In the thin, sharp air of November 1886, along the North Platte River in the Wyoming Territory, Elspeth McLeod began to dig. She did not choose a plot of prairie sod or the shelter of the cottonwoods that lined the lower floodplain. Instead, she chose a place no one else would have looked at twice except to note its precariousness. A high, sheer-cut bank carved by some ancient spring flood. A 30-foot wall of layered earth, clay, and stone. To the scattered homesteaders of the region, this was a place of collapse and erosion, not a foundation. But Elspeth, a widow of 4 months with 2 young children whose breath already plumed in the mornings inside their threadbare cabin, saw not a crumbling wall, but a thick blanket. She drove the spade into a narrow, vertical fissure near the base, a crack no wider than her hand, and the sound of steel on damp soil was a lonely declaration against the vast, coming silence of winter. It did not take long for her labor to be noticed. News, like the wind, traveled fast across the open land, and the sight of a lone woman attacking a riverbank with a shovel was peculiar enough to warrant a visit. Hiram Poole, whose land bordered the quarter section that had belonged to Elspeth and her late husband, was the first to arrive. He rode up on his stout gelding, reining in at a respectful distance, his face a mask of practical concern etched by years of squinting at horizons and ledgers. He watched for a full 5 minutes as Elspeth, her skirts hitched and grimed with mud, methodically cleared earth from the fissure, her movements economical and steady. She was not flailing in a fit of grief-stricken madness, as the nascent gossip suggested. She was working. This, to Hiram, was perhaps even more troubling. "Mistress McLeod," he finally called out, his voice carrying a weight of neighborly authority. Elspeth paused, resting one hand on the handle of the spade, and looked up at him. Her face was smudged with dirt, her expression unreadable. "That is no place to be digging," Hiram stated, not as an opinion, but as an incontrovertible fact of the land. "The first thaw will bring that whole bank down on top of you. It is God's own foolishness." He expected tears or a desperate plea, or at the very least a weary admission of defeat. He did not expect the quiet resolve in her eyes. "The earth here is stable, Mr. Poole," she replied, her voice low but clear. "The layers are compacted. It will hold." Hiram dismounted, the leather of his saddle creaking in the cold. He walked closer, pointing with a gloved hand. "It is a mud wall, clay and river silt. What purpose can this possibly serve? Winter is a week off, not a year. You and the children can take the old tenant room behind our kitchen. The missus has already aired it out." It was a genuine offer, born of a mixture of Christian duty and a deep-seated aversion to witnessing a disaster he had not tried to prevent. But Elspeth simply shook her head. "I am grateful for your kindness, truly," she said, turning back to her work. "But we will have our own place." This refusal, more than the digging itself, cemented the community's view. Dora Kelleher, Hiram's wife's cousin, held court by her stove later that day, pronouncing Elspeth McLeod had been broken by her loss. "Grief takes many forms," she said to a captive audience of 2 other homestead wives, "but digging one's own grave is a new one on me. Poor thing, and with those 2 little ones." The sentiment of pity was a comfortable cloak for their judgment. Only Ruth Hartley, who had known Elspeth since she arrived as a bride 5 years prior, remained silent, watching from her own porch with a spyglass, a knot of unease and reluctant curiosity tightening in her stomach. She saw not madness, but a desperate, singular focus she could not yet comprehend. Elspeth heard the whispers in town when she went for her meager supplies. She saw the pitying looks and felt the careful distance people gave her, as if she were afflicted with a contagion of sorrow. They did not understand, and she knew she could not make them. Her knowledge was not their knowledge. It was not the shared wisdom of farmers and ranchers, of reading the sky for snow and the behavior of cattle for signs of a hard winter. Hers was a different catechism, learned not from the land itself, but from a man who had made his life understanding what was beneath it. Her late husband, Ewan, had been a mining engineer from the coalfields of Scotland, a man whose hands were as comfortable with geological survey maps as they were with a pickaxe. He had seen the world not as a surface to be lived upon, but as a layered, structured thing, full of pressures, temperatures, and hidden strengths. She remembered a summer evening, sitting on the porch of the home they had built together, the very home the bank now owned and had left her with only until the end of the month. Ewan had been drawing in a notebook, explaining a problem at a silver mine 50 miles west. "They are digging a vent shaft," he had told her, tapping the paper with his pencil. "The deeper they go, the hotter it gets. The men complain, but it is the way of things. The earth holds the sun's heat from 1,000 summers past, Elspeth. It holds its own warmth from its making. Down deep, the seasons do not matter. The winter cannot reach it. It is a constant." He had looked out at the very same cut bank she was now excavating. "Look there," he had said, his voice full of a quiet, academic excitement. "You see those strata? Sandstone, then that thick seam of blue clay, then shale. Each layer is a page in a book, and each one is an insulator for the one below it. 30, 40 feet in, and the temperature will be the same in January as it is in July." This was the principle that now drove her spade into the cold ground. It was not a hope or a prayer. It was a physical law, as real to her as the law of gravity. She had tried to explain it once, in the simplest of terms, to Hiram Poole on his second visit. He had found her 10 feet into the bank, working by lantern light in the deepening twilight. "The deep earth is warm, Mr. Poole," she had said, her voice slightly muffled by the enclosing tunnel. "It stays near 55 degrees, no matter the cold outside." Hiram had simply stared at her, his expression a mixture of confusion and profound disappointment. "Mistress MacLeod," he had said slowly, as if to a child, "the earth freezes. The ground becomes hard as iron. I have buried kin in December. I know how cold the earth gets." He was not wrong, but he was not right either. He knew the surface. Ewan had taught her the depths. Watching an outcome, she thought as she dug, was not the same as understanding the principle. Hiram had seen the frozen crust. Ewan had explained the living heart. The work was a slow, punishing battle against the earth itself. The initial fissure Ewan had pointed out served as a guide, a natural weakness in the bank's face. For the first 10 feet, the soil was a mix of loose silt and gravel, and her progress was swift. She filled a wheelbarrow, hauled it to the river's edge, and dumped it, the growing pile a testament to her relentless effort. Her hands, accustomed to needlework and kneading dough, became raw, then blistered, then calloused. Her back and shoulders screamed with a dull, constant fire. But with every foot she gained, the composition of the earth changed. It became denser, colder, and wetter. A thick blue-gray clay that clung to her shovel and boots with a greedy suction. This was the layer Ewan had spoken of, the impermeable seal. It was harder to dig, but she welcomed its appearance. It was proof. She was not just digging a hole. She was engineering a space. From the wreckage of a small barn that had collapsed under snow the previous winter, she salvaged timbers. They were weathered and gray, but the heartwood was still sound. As she burrowed deeper, she began to shore up the tunnel, placing 2 upright posts every 4 feet and laying a heavy crosspiece on top. It was a technique she had seen Ewan sketch 100 times, the basic geometry of a mine shaft. She wedged the timbers tight against the ceiling and walls, not because she feared an immediate collapse, the clay was holding like stone, but because Ewan had taught her that any structure made by man within the earth must respect the immense, slow, patient pressure of the ground around it. The shoring was an act of foresight, a conversation with the future thaws and freezes she knew would come. At a depth she measured with a knotted rope to be nearly 30 feet, the character of her labor changed. She stopped digging forward and began to hollow out a chamber, carving a space roughly 8 feet square and 6 feet high. The air in the tunnel was still and cold, but it lacked the biting edge of the wind outside. The smell was of deep, damp earth, the scent of a root cellar, of minerals and water that had not seen the sun in a millennium. Here, she worked with a smaller trowel, shaving the clay from the walls, her movements precise and careful. She shaped a sleeping platform along one wall, a raised bank of earth that would lift them from the floor. On the opposite side, she carved out niches that would serve as shelves. As she worked, she would occasionally press her palm flat against the wall of the chamber. It was cold, yes, but it was the cold of a deep well, not the killing frost of the world above. A steady, neutral cold that she knew, with the addition of a few bodies and a small lamp, would transform into a gentle, life-sustaining warmth. The final, most critical pieces of her construction were the door and the flue. For the door, she used the salvaged planks from the old barn, nailing them together into a thick, solid rectangle. But a simple wooden door would not suffice. She built a second layer of planks, leaving a 4-inch gap between them. Into this space, she packed dried moss, grass, and scraps of wool from worn-out blankets, creating an insulated core. She hung this heavy door at the tunnel's entrance, fitting it into a frame she had built so that it would sit flush and tight, with strips of leather tacked around the edges to seal any gaps. For the flue, she used several lengths of stovepipe she had traded her last good hen for. She ran it from the corner of the living chamber, up through the packed earth of the ceiling, and out the top of the riverbank 30 feet above, a tiny, defiant chimney against the gray sky. It was not for a roaring fire. A large fire in such a small, enclosed space would be a death sentence. It was for a tiny bachelor stove, just big enough to cook a pot of stew and, more importantly, to draw fresh air into the dwelling and expel the used air, a principle of ventilation Ewan had drilled into her as the most vital lesson of living underground. The day she finished, the sky was the color of lead, and the first snowflakes, fat and wet, began to drift down. She stood for a moment outside her strange new home, a dark opening in the riverbank, shored with timber and sealed by a thick, crude door. The wind was rising, carrying the scent of ice and immense distance. She gathered her 2 children, 7-year-old Thomas and 5-year-old Lily, along with their few belongings: 2 mattresses stuffed with straw, a trunk of clothes, a box of kitchen essentials, and the precious thermometer that had belonged to their father. Thomas, old enough to feel the shame of their situation, looked at the dark hole with fear. "It is a cave, Mama," he whispered. "Yes," Elspeth said, her voice calm and certain. "It is our cave. It will be warm. Now, help me with this mattress." She led them inside into the earthy darkness and pulled the heavy door shut. The world outside, with its rising wind and falling snow, vanished. The only sound was their own breathing and the soft, immediate stillness of the deep earth. The blizzard arrived that night. It did not come gently, but as a furious, roaring assault. The wind shrieked over the prairie, scouring the ground, piling snow into immense drifts that buried fences and obliterated roads. In their conventional, above-ground cabins, the settlers fought a desperate battle against the cold. They stuffed rags into the cracks in their walls, burned precious wood at an alarming rate, and huddled together, listening to the storm trying to tear their homes apart. Hiram Poole lay awake, the sound of the wind a physical pressure against the walls of his house. He thought of the widow McLeod and her children in their hole in the riverbank. He pictured the snow sealing the entrance, the river ice creeping up the bank, the sheer folly of it all. He felt a grim certainty that he would be leading a recovery party in the spring, not a rescue mission now. He commended her soul to God and tried to sleep. Inside the earth, there was no wind. The furious howl of the blizzard was reduced to a low, distant hum, a vibration felt more than heard, like the drone of a faraway bee. Elspeth had lit a single tallow lamp, which cast a small, flickering circle of light in the chamber. The air was still and quiet. At first, it was cold, the kind of deep, damp chill that sinks into your bones. The children huddled with her on the sleeping platform, wrapped in every blanket they owned. For hours, she simply waited, trusting. This was the crucible, the moment where the principle would either prove true or fail catastrophically. There was no feedback, no sign of what was happening outside the door or deep within the earth. It was an act of pure faith, not in a deity, but in physics, in the memory of her husband's quiet, confident voice explaining the thermal mass of the planet. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the character of the air began to change. The biting chill receded, replaced not by a draft of heat, but by a slow, radiant saturation of the space. It was the combined warmth of their three bodies, the tiny flame of the lamp, and the small stove where she was now heating a thin broth. This small output of energy was not leaking away into the infinite cold of the Wyoming winter. It was being caught, held, and reflected back by the tons of earth surrounding them. The clay walls, which had at first felt like blocks of ice, were now merely cool to the touch. The air no longer stole her breath. She tended to her system with the patience of a watchmaker. Every hour, she would take the long, thin pole she had prepared and push it up through the stovepipe flue, clearing the snow that accumulated over the opening far above, ensuring the vital flow of air. It was a small, crucial task, the difference between a shelter and a tomb. After the first night, the change was undeniable. Elspeth awoke from a few hours of shallow sleep and realized she was no longer shivering. Lily, tucked against her side, was breathing evenly, her small face relaxed in a way it had not been for weeks. Thomas was still wrapped tightly in his blanket, but the frantic tension was gone from his small frame. Elspeth sat up and, as a test, she shrugged off the heavy woolen shawl she had been wearing constantly for a month. She waited, expecting the cold to rush back in. It did not. The air on her arms was cool, but not uncomfortable. An hour later, she removed her thick outer sweater, leaving her in just her shirt sleeves. She could move freely, her limbs feeling light and unbound. This was the moment of truth, the first personal proof. She walked to the far wall of the chamber, the one deepest in the earth, and retrieved Ewan's thermometer from the niche where she had placed it. She held it against the clay wall for a full minute, her fingers pressed beside it, feeling the neutral coolness of the earth. Then she brought it back to the lamplight. The mercury, which had read 20 degrees Fahrenheit when they first entered, had risen steadily. It now stood at 58 degrees. It was a miracle, but a miracle of engineering, not of prayer. She felt a profound, quiet triumph that had no need for an audience. It was a deeply personal vindication, a sensory climax experienced in the feeling of still, warm air on her skin in the heart of a blizzard. She looked around the small, womb-like space, at the curve of the earthen walls, the steady flame of the lamp, the dark shapes of her sleeping children. This was not a grave. It was a sanctuary. In that moment, Ewan was more present to her than he had been since his death. Not as a ghost, but as a living idea. His words, his drawings, his patient explanations, they had become a physical reality. He had given her more than his love and his children. He had given her a principle to live by, a key to unlock the hidden charity of the earth. She sat on the edge of the platform, listening to the muffled rage of the storm, and felt a wave of gratitude so powerful it was almost a physical ache. He had not left them unprotected, after all. The blizzard raged for 3 days and 3 nights. On the 4th morning, the world outside the door fell silent. Elspeth waited another full day, letting the storm truly break and the initial, blinding glare of the sun on the new snow subside. When she finally pushed open the heavy, insulated door, the change in pressure made a soft whoosh. A wall of brilliant white stood before her. Snow drifted halfway up the door itself. She dug her way out into a transformed world. The sky was a fierce, painful blue, and the landscape was an ocean of snow, sculpted by the wind into waves and crests of impossible size. The cold was immediate and brutal, a physical shock that stole the air from her lungs. It was, she guessed, well below zero. She quickly resealed the door, leaving only a small crack, and retreated into the steady, quiet warmth of her sanctuary, a feeling of profound security settling over her. For Hiram Poole, the end of the storm brought only a new phase of struggle. The temperature had plummeted, and the snow was too deep for his cattle to find forage. He and his hired man spent 2 days digging paths to the hayrick and the creek, their energy sapped by the punishing cold. One of his cows, a prize milker, had given birth during the storm, and the newborn calf was weak, shivering violently in the drafty barn. Hiram knew it would not survive another night there. His wife, her face etched with worry, finally spoke the thought he had been pushing away. "Hiram, you have to go and see. You have to." He knew she meant Elspeth MacLeod. He had resisted, ashamed of the morbid curiosity, but the calf's plight gave him a practical reason. "It needs a warm place," his wife urged, "and if, by some miracle—" She left the sentence unfinished. Cursing his own foolishness, but driven by a sliver of desperate hope, Hiram bundled himself in his heaviest coat and began the arduous trek through the drifts toward the riverbank, carrying the freezing calf in a burlap sack. He found the place only because he had marked its position relative to a trio of old cottonwoods. The riverbank was a smooth white wave, with no sign of any opening. He felt a grim, self-righteous finality. She had dug her own tomb, and the snow had provided the burial. He was about to turn back when he saw it. A thin, dark line of vapor rising from the top of the bank. A wisp of smoke or steam, disappearing almost instantly into the frigid air. It was the flue. His heart hammered against his ribs. He slid down the drift toward the face of the bank and began digging frantically with his hands where he estimated the door should be. After a few minutes, his fingers struck wood. He cleared the snow away and knocked, his knuckles making a dull, solid thud. There was a pause, then the sound of a bar being lifted from inside. The thick door swung inward, opening a rectangle of darkness. A wave of warm, damp air washed over his face, so startlingly different from the outside world that he flinched back. It smelled of earth, of cooked food, and of human habitation. Elspeth stood in the opening, silhouetted against the lamplight behind her. She was in her shirt sleeves, her hair slightly damp, her face calm. Behind her, he could see one of the children playing quietly on a raised earthen platform. The sight was so utterly contrary to every expectation, so completely impossible, that for a moment, Hiram could not speak. He just stood there, knee-deep in snow, the frigid air burning his lungs, staring into a scene of impossible, subterranean comfort. The dying calf in his arms gave a weak bleat. Elspeth's gaze dropped to the sack. "It is freezing," Hiram managed to say, his voice hoarse. "The barn is too cold." Elspeth said nothing. She simply stepped back, holding the door open for him. Hiram ducked his head and entered, dragging the calf behind him. The warmth enveloped him completely. It was not the dry, scorching heat of a stove, but a gentle, pervasive warmth that seemed to radiate from the very walls. He took off his gloves, then his hat. He felt the sweat begin to prickle on his forehead. He looked around the chamber, at the timbered ceiling, the smooth clay walls, the niches holding plates and cups. He saw the thermometer hanging from a nail. He walked over and peered at it. The mercury stood at 60 degrees. He turned and looked at Elspeth, who was ladling water into a bowl for the calf. "How?" he asked, the single word holding all of his disbelief, his failed logic, and his dawning, profound respect. "I told you, Mr. Poole," Elspeth said softly, without a trace of triumph in her voice. "The deep earth is warm." Hiram Poole stayed for an hour. He drank a cup of hot broth Elspeth offered him, and he watched the calf, which had been stretched out as if dead, slowly lift its head and begin to suckle the warm water. When he left, he was a different man. He did not try to offer charity again. Instead, he asked questions. He asked about the timbers, about the depth, about the flue. Elspeth answered each one simply and directly. That afternoon, he sent his hired man over with a side of bacon and a sack of flour. Not as charity, but as payment. Payment for the life of the calf, and for a lesson he was only beginning to understand. The news of Elspeth's survival and the impossible warmth of her Riverbank home spread through the settlement not as gossip, but as legend. Ruth Hartley was the next to visit, bringing a jar of honey and an open, inquisitive mind. She sat in the warmth, listened to Elspeth, and left with the quiet understanding that she had just witnessed the birth of a new kind of frontier wisdom. Elspeth McLeod's innovation, born of a husband's knowledge and a wife's desperate will, did not remain a private miracle. As the winter wore on, others came. They came to see, to feel the warmth, and to learn. She shared her knowledge freely, explaining Ewan's principles of thermal mass and ventilation to men who had only ever known how to build with logs and sod on top of the frozen ground. The following year, Hiram Poole, with Elspeth's guidance, dug a similar, larger chamber into a hillside behind his barn, a winter shelter for his calves that saved his herd and became the model for others. The concept of the river womb, as it came to be known, was adapted. Men began digging their root cellars deeper, past the frost line, ensuring their stores of potatoes and apples never froze again. The design became a blueprint for survival in a land that was notoriously unforgiving. Elspeth's dugout itself remained her family's winter home for 5 years, until she had saved enough to build a proper house on a new plot of land. But even then, they maintained it, using it for storage and as a storm shelter. Her son, Thomas, who had first entered it with fear, would later bring his own children to see the timbered tunnel and the cozy earthen room, telling them the story of the great blizzard of '86 and the quiet, brilliant woman who learned to listen to the earth. The shelter stood for over 70 years, a slowly collapsing but enduring monument not to a single act of desperation, but to the powerful, transformative legacy of a single, well-understood principle.